Once upon a time, in England, a few years after World War II, a very important clergyman, a bishop in fact, decided to pay a visit to his niece, who had married a country parson, a vicar, in a small town, and he was shown into the sitting room of this vicarage and was waiting for someone to greet him when all of a sudden the French doors to the garden burst open and a man in his underwear rushed in, eyes wild, foaming gibberish at the mouth, it sounded like Russian, and carrying a solid iron fireplace poker. And he rushed at the bishop as if to attack him. Now the bishop looked a little bit like Marlon Brando. He had long silver hair, but instead of having a mumble, he spoke in a very important British-sounding accent. And he crumbled to the ground immediately and covered his head and cowered with his eyes shut tight. And he heard the sounds of a struggle. There were thumps and groans, and when he opened his eyes finally, there was no one there. And when the maid came in a breathless voice, he explained, "I have been attacked by a half-dressed man with a hard rod." Now, you may think it's a terrible thing to be attacked by a half-dressed man with a hard rod, or you may not. To each his own, I've always said. But to an actor like me, the opportunity to say a line like that, well, that was the tipping point for me to choose to play the bishop in a British farce called See How They Run last month. And an actor, let me tell you, loves a good line. Just watch how much Lauren Bacall enjoys saying that famous line of hers. You know how to whistle, don't you? You just put your lips together and blow. Or even more importantly, in terms of cinema history, when Bronson Pinchot says to the Beverly Hills Cop, "Would you like a lemon twist with your espresso?" Actors love good lines. So you'll know how dispirited, how despondent I felt when I got an email from the director a month before we started rehearsals saying the prop, the poker, was being cut. He was replacing it with a clay sculpture of a gnome. Exhibit A. You'll notice the caption underneath says, "Not a fireplace poker." And I said, actors get pushed around too much, so I fired off an email and I said, I will not perform this role. I repeat, will not perform this role unless I get to deliver that line as written. And the director agreed. So the poker stayed in. And when we read through the play for the very first time, the cast laughed at that line, and I thought, hey, that's great. Kind of like you did just now, only I thought your laugh was kind of a 5 or 6, but when I read it on the page the first time, I thought, oh, that's a 9 or a 10 laugh. That's all right. But after a few days of rehearsal, the cast really wasn't laughing at all at that line anymore, but that's fairly typical. Casts get numb to the humor of a play until they get an audience to laugh at the lines again. But then there was that prop. The very first time it appeared in the middle of rehearsal, the fireplace poker. They wanted a safe version of a wrought iron poker, so they made one with a rubber tip and a wooden shaft. A very heavy rubber tip. So the very first time it was just swung through the air. Just swung through the air. It snapped in half like an old toothpick. And the director saw its opening and he said, "The gnome is back in." I said, "No, not the gnome." Comedy is so subjective. Edmund Kean, the famous tragic actor, said, on his deathbed, actually dying, "Dying is easy. Comedy is hard." One man's poker is another man's gnome. So, there was one ray of sunshine that the director allowed through the clouds. He said, Mike, you mentioned the weapon 3 or 4 times in the course of the play, and why don't you refer to the gnome in your own way? Play with it. Make it your own. And I went, really? So over the course of the run of the production, in the bishop's mind, as he retold the story, the gnome started to grow in proportion. It started out as a gnome, But very soon it became a lawn ornament with a pointy hat kind of terrifying thing in front of him. And then it became a ceramic fairy. And finally, a gargoyle. The reviews mentioned the gnome as an odd choice. I thought so too. But every one of them loved the show. And so that's the moral of the story. Not there's no place like gnome, but that every gnome can have a silver lining if you're allowed to put your own color with it. Thank you.